Welcome back to the Lamb of Odd. Recording conditions are suboptimal, but I repeat myself. Yes, I am not in fact dead. I apologize for my long-term absence. There has been more going on in the past probably 3 months of my life than most other points of my life put together, so I appreciate everybody bearing with me and just kind of dealing with the absence as I put things together. So, as you can see, I've had to move again. I'm in the process of putting together a studio. I am standing far away from my computer, so I can't hold my microphone, so I'm going to be holding a variety of props instead. Something tells me YouTube wouldn't enjoy me brandishing my collection of World War I firearms, so I'm going to just try fiddling with various things as we go along. Well, you studied Assyriology, I studied the blade. No, I'm not a weeb, by the way. I don't want to see any accusations here. I'm also not 100% sure what to do with the background here. So there's kind of two different options here I could use your guys' help with. One option is I could put all of my books in the background on bookshelves. Alternatively, I could hang up my art and get more art, because I like religious and philosophical art, and put it in the background. A lot of people on the internet, especially people who deal with advanced topics like this, have bookshelves, and I get why that is, but every time I see it, it just seems a little bit pretentious, where it's just kind of showing off, like, here's how smart I am. I kind of don't like the idea of doing that. At the same time, I do physically need bookshelves to put my books in places. They're all in boxes scattered on the ground right now. But I could do that elsewhere as well. So if anybody has any preference on what they would like to see, art, bookshelves, or a combination of the two, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'll put a poll up on the channel as well. But I could really use some insight on that. So today we are talking about girls, specifically women, specifically the archetypal woman in the book of Genesis. Now, I don't want to alarm my male audience, which according to YouTube is all of you. I get it, girls are scary, but please just bear with me today. We're going to get through this one together, alright? So specifically today we're going to be continuing our discussion of Genesis 2 by talking about the creation of Eve's story. In the last video, posted too long ago, we talked about the creation of Adam. Now we're going to be talking about the creation of Eve, so continuing the story along. And before anybody asks, no, I'm not wearing a pink sports coat just because I'm talking about women today. I got this one at a major discount, which I'm obligated to tell you because I'm Norwegian, and I thought it looked cool with my shirt, so that's what we're dealing with. Also, it's currently 104 degrees outside, and I'm going to try to make this video shorter, partially because of that, because the air conditioning in my apartment does not work, and neither does the internet, so I don't even know when I'm going to be able to get this up. So, we work with what we have. Just to recap the last video, we talked about the creation of the first human. The term in Hebrew, Adam, literally translates to humanity or humankind, or in our narrative context here, human. And that's how I'm going to continue to refer to this character. So I'm referring to Adam, the traditional name for the first human, as the human, or simply human in the course of this narrative. Likewise, the name Eve doesn't actually show up until later in the story here, which is important, and we'll get to that in a second. So I'm going to refer to her when she shows up as the woman, which is how she's referred to as throughout the course of the narrative until she arrives at her final name. After describing the creation of the human and the establishment of that human in the Garden of Eden, or the garden that's at Eden, the narrative continues to describe the creation of a female human. And Yahweh God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make for him a helper to be his opposite." It's important to note that I'm using my own contemporary translation here that I produce out of the Hebrew text, so the wording is going to be a little bit off from any translation you find out there, but I chose them all of my renderings specifically for a reason. Now, it's important to know that this is the first time, either in the isolated story of the creation of Adam and Eve, or in the broader biblical story of creation that includes Genesis 1, that this is the first time that Yahweh God says, this thing is not good. The word good has a lot of important nuances when it comes to creation. In order to save you a lot of time, essentially some scholars like Dr. John Walton have argued that good in this context refers to functioning properly. That is, this thing is carrying out the function that it was designed for in the way that it was intended to. So for instance, in Genesis 1, when the whole cosmos is being formed, the sun, moon, and stars are carrying out their functions properly, therefore being good, if they're orbiting in the proper sequence, providing light, providing the regular means of telling seasons and times and years and months and so on and so forth here. And so when we arrive at the creation of the female human, the initial state is God has a human being who is ostensibly male as far as the narrative tells us. We'll get to that in a second here. And yet this male human isn't able to carry out the function of humanity properly as God intended it. God created the human to carry out human function, and yet this isolated male human is unable to carry out all of the functions of humanity by himself. So the solution to this is for God to create an Ezer Kenegdo, a helper as his opposite. There's two important components to this, specifically Ezer and Neged. The term Ezer typically means helper. That's how it's often translated. And before anybody takes offense at this or starts jumping to conclusions here, the term helper doesn't mean a subordinate servant or anything of that nature. In several texts, God is referred to as the helper, the Ezer, of Israel. So we're talking about a co-worker or somebody who's working alongside somebody else, a sunergos in some sense. So that's what the term Ezer refers to. Now, the text could have left it as just an Ezer, God making a helper for the human being. And even if that was the case and God had created a female human to help the male human, we would have been on pretty good standing so far. But it's interesting that there's another term added in there, Kenegdo. This is a complicated collocation consisting of a prepositional phrase, a core word, and a third-person masculine singular possessive pronoun. And this is a really important caveat to the Ezer language. So this term can be translated in a variety of different ways. I've chosen to translate it as a helper as his opposite. I'll get into that in a second here, but basically we see a lot of architectural language used in the creation of the woman here in Genesis 2. So the reason that's important is because there's parallels made to architectural construction elsewhere, and in several architectural texts in the Old Testament itself, specifically describing the construction of the Temple of Solomon, we find the term neged used for one side of a building corresponding to another side of a building. Well, the particular usage isn't applied in the term I'm about to use. You might imagine one pillar standing on the other side of another pillar that both work together to support a roof. Again, that particular context isn't used with the term neged, but it kind of captures the idea of a corresponding opposite that is important in the architecture of a structure. But we don't jump to the creation of the female human right away. First of all, God creates a variety of beings to see if any of them can function as the Ezer Kenegdo of the human being. And Yahweh God formed from the ground every living creature of the wilderness and all the birds of the heavens. As I've mentioned in previous videos, this narrative was originally independent from the Genesis 1 story where God creates the universe. And so in the Genesis 2 story itself, this is the first time that birds and animals were created here. It's important to note, too, that God creates the animals and the birds out of the dust of the ground, which is the same process that he used to create the human being. Remember, we talked at length on how the human, or Adam, was produced out of the dust of the earth, dust symbolizing mortality, this thing that you return to after you die by laying down in the dust again. So God is creating animals, not quite ex nihilo, but ex dustio, it's wrong, but run with it, in a parallel form to how he created Adam. And yet, the creation of the animals isn't enough to give the human being a helper as his opposite. As the text continues to read, "And the human named the names of all the cattle and the birds of heavens and all the living things of the wilderness. But as for the human, he did not find a helper as his opposite." There's a couple important things going on here. First of all, it's clear that none of the creatures created by God, the animals, the birds, the beasts of the field, are capable of providing the human being his oppositeness. As we're going to get to in a second here, the figure who becomes his opposite, his pair, has more to do than purely reproductive potential. It's not that Adam was looking for someone to reproduce with and create more humans. In fact, this doesn't happen until after the quote-unquote fall at the end of the story here. But rather, it's a sort of parallel functionary to the human being. None of the animals that God created was capable of fulfilling that function itself. So it's important to know. It's also important to note here that Adam names all of the animals that are created here. Naming, as we've discussed in our Genesis 1 video, is a means of demonstrating mastery over something. It's a means of saying, hey, I was here before you, I'm giving a name to you, and it's going to describe part of what you do and how you carry out your function. This philosophy may be derived from naming conventions in the ancient Near East, where parents named children, as is still common practice today, but it demonstrates mastery over something. So keep that in mind, as we're going to see that the name Eve isn't actually applied to Eve until a later time. The text continues, "And Yahweh God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. And he took one of his halves and closed flesh in place of it." There's a couple important things to talk about here. First of all, the sleep that Adam goes into is what's called in Hebrew tardemah. Tardemah has a variety of uses. It can refer to simply a deep sleep. It can also refer to a prophetic sleep that a prophet might fall into and receive a vision or a dream. Some have made this connection to suggest that everything that Adam sees from this point onward is exactly that. He's having a visionary dream in his deep sleep. But I'm not 100% sure that that's specifically what the text is referring to. It could simply be that Adam has been anesthetized, and has been put into deep sleep for the procedure which is to follow. Speaking of that procedure, this is typically the part in the text that most translations have God taking a rib out of Adam and forming it into the woman. Spoiler alert for the next verse over. But the interesting thing is that as I've chosen to translate this, the word for rib, tselah, doesn't necessarily just refer to a singular rib out of the human being. It seems to refer to one side or one half of the human being. Now, the lexical range of what tselah, rib, can mean can include a rib as in part of the anatomical composition of a human being or of any other animal for that matter. In fact, in some butchery texts, both in the Levitical texts of the Hebrew Bible and in Akkadian cognates, it refers to the entire rack of ribs on one side of an animal, again in the context of producing a temple sacrifice or in butchery contexts. But the context of Genesis 2 isn't butchery or sacrifice. Neither of those concepts show up for several more chapters here. Instead, the context that we find here in Genesis 2 is architectural. I've already mentioned that neged can refer to one part of an architectural structure standing opposite to another, which is somehow its equivalent or its opposite. Again, here we see somewhat architectural language in the idea of tselah, because tselah can also refer to one half of a thing, specifically when it comes to an architectural structure. So I would suggest that rather than taking a rack of ribs off of Adam and forming it into the woman, God has instead bisected Adam in one half. He's cut Adam in two vertically, taken one half to form into the woman, and the other half he's closed up with flesh to return Adam to his whole state, so he's not hopping around on one leg and using one hand. That I assume would be very inconvenient, but I don't know for sure. This has classically been taken by some rabbinic interpreters to imply that the original human being, the human that God creates, was a hermaphrodite, bearing both male and female characteristics, and that this verse actually implies that God took the female half out and separated the male half and the female halves from each other. This is found in several references in the Babylonian Talmud, for instance, and this idea probably draws on the Platonic story found in Plato's Symposium in the speech of Aristophanes, which refers to a similar story of human beings originally being both male and female, having 4 arms and 4 legs, and 2 heads, which were later separated by the gods into male and female halves because they were too powerful for the gods to handle. This Greek story may have influenced the rabbi's reading of this, but the grammar is definitely there. The human being divided between 2 halves, one of which becomes female, and the other which remains male. That being said, there's nothing in the text itself to imply that Adam was originally hermaphroditic or androgynous, and was later divided into 2 different halves of the male and female halves, respectively. It seems rather that the story implies that the human being was originally male, and that he was later divided into a male half, and the other half that was taken away was molded into a female figure. The text goes on to describe the creation of the woman from the half of Adam. And Yahweh God built the side which he took from the man into a woman, and he brought her to the man. Specifically, the verb here is bana, which means to build. It's almost exclusively an architectural term. And this is the verb that colors the earlier language about opposites and correspondence, because it specifically says that God builds the half into the woman. It doesn't say that he makes it, using the verb asa, which is the term that he uses to create the animals from the dust of the earth and Adam from the dust of the earth, but rather it uses the term build, which suggests that the earlier language that could be architectural potentially is almost certainly architectural, as this verb sort of governs the whole process that's going on here lexically. So again, what the text seems to be describing is Adam, or the human, falling into a deep sleep, God bisecting the human in half vertically, taking one half and filling it in with flesh to restore the human to his original state, and taking the other half to form into the female human, the woman. This is actually quite unique, or at least rare, among ancient stories of anthropogenesis, because in most stories of the creation of humanity, you don't find a specific creation of male humans and a specific creation of female humans. There is one interesting parallel in an Egyptian novel called The Tale of Two Brothers, where an exiled man finds himself in the cedar forest where the Ennead, a series of 9 important Egyptian gods, live, and they take pity on him and create a woman ex nihilo to be his pair, to be his opposite, although that particular language isn't used in the story. There might be vestiges or traces of this story in the creation of Eve's story, but if so, the ideas in the particular details of the story are specifically Israelite and Hebrew, as we're going to get to in a second here. And although disappointed by the creation of the animals, which couldn't form a helper as his opposite, the human is elated at seeing the female human, the woman, brought to him. As the text continues, And the human said, "This time, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Concerning this one, it will be called woman, because from man this one was taken." There's kind of a lot going on here. First of all, this is the first time that we see the term male or man, ish in Hebrew, show up in the Bible. Again, earlier the human being was called Adam, human. So it's interesting that now, having recognized the female aspect of humanity, we're now divided between ish, man, and isha, woman or female. So humanity is now properly divided. Now, the male figure continues to be called Adam or human, whereas the female figure is called Isha consistently through the text until she's named at a later time. But it's interesting that we see the bifurcation between the male and female halves of humanity here. It's interesting, too, that the term bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh seems to be an etiology. It was pretty common in the ancient world for extended family to refer to one another as my own bone and flesh. We see this, for instance, in Genesis 29 when Laban meets his nephew Jacob, and he refers to him as his own bone and flesh. We see this in other contexts as well in the Hebrew Bible to refer to broader connections like clan relationships, suggesting that even extended family could refer to one another as their own bone and flesh, referring to their own connectedness in a family system. And this brings us to the concluding verse of this particular story in verse 24. "Therefore a man leaves his father and mother, and he becomes loyal to his wife, and they will be one flesh." This verse often gets used at weddings to describe the union of the bride and groom, and that may have originally been its intended use in the ancient world in its original Sitzim Leben. But there's a couple other things going on here that I think are worth pointing out. First of all, I've chosen to translate the phrase typically translated as cleave to his wife or cling to his wife, the Hebrew verb davak. I've chosen to translate this as to be loyal to his wife. This isn't referring to loyalty within a relationship so much as it is the pledging of one's loyalty within a family unit. We see the contrast of this with leaving his own father and mother's household and being united to his wife, davaking to his wife. So the contrast seems to be the man who's getting married is no longer primarily loyal to his parents as a subservient member of their household. He's now become a member of a new household between him and his wife. His loyalty lies particularly with his wife as opposed to with his parents as his primary responsibility. It's important to note, too, that the phrase, "and they will become one flesh," is often taken as a sexual euphemism, yet in the original context, this doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. There are definitely some scholars like Ron Hendel who argue for this fact, but it seems more likely that becoming one flesh refers to becoming a singular family unit, or a new family unit, which was considered to be one flesh or one organizational entity, as opposed to being the subordinate unit within the older family system. The text continues on in verse 25, which is the final verse of chapter 2, but I actually think that this verse fits better with the beginning of chapter 3, so I'm going to leave it for the time being until we make the next video. And that's what I have for you today here. I apologize for the shorter video, but as you can see, there's a lot going on. So thanks so much for bearing with me. I plan to have more of these coming out as time goes on, and try to upload a little bit more regularly. I also fell down a massive rabbit hole that I hope to share with you all very soon here. But thank you so much for bearing with me. Have a great rest of your day. I look forward to seeing you all very, very soon.